Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I'm joined by, again, no stranger, he's been on several times now, Dr. David Kemball-Cook. Hey, David.
Hi there. Hi.
Awesome. It feels good. I just get to call you David this time. I don't have to differentiate
Uh,
you from the other David.
right.
So yeah, I guess just as a quick intro, what have you been up to since the last time you were on the show? Anything interesting or?
Yes, well, not for me, yes, interesting. I've been rereading David Bentley Hart's The Experience of God,
Mhm.
which I read early last year, after reading Bernardo Kastrup's book on idealism, and I go along with a lot of what David Bentley Hart says there. It's he's talking about being, consciousness, and bliss as the three ways of understanding God in the classical sense. And I go along with that sort of process of thought, this general sense that we're picking up the classical theism across all different religions of God as being behind creation, um, being somehow enveloping consciousness and being the source of bliss or blessing and morality as well, and ethics, and this general way of understanding God. I'm in sympathy with him, but the second time reading it, I'm getting very irritated because he's always attacking materialism, the materialistic way of understanding things. The Daniel Dennett line, which there's no such thing as consciousness, or whatever. That everything is just made up of atoms and physical processes, and that the world is just the way it is, and it just has always existed, and so on. But I'm getting very irritated with that because he's very verbal and prolix in his criticisms, but he does not actually say what his model is. Now, the way you see it, metaphysics, you've got three basic metaphysical models. You've got materialism, you've got dualism, and then you've got idealism. Those are the kind of three ways of looking at the world, if you like. Either the world is fundamentally matter and energy, or the world is fundamentally consciousness and mind, or the world is the universe is kind of a mixture of, but has both, but interacting in some way. Um, and he talks about materialism and criticizes it. He talks about dualism and in a more friendly way, but still criticize that. He doesn't mention idealism at all. And he doesn't say what his own model is. He doesn't say what his preferred model. And maybe he's going to say that at the end, but I'm over halfway through now. And so I'm getting a bit irritated with him.
Yeah, there is a tendency in these debates to always just focus on those binary options. I
Yeah,
guess because they're the majority opinion or something like
yeah,
that. So yep, I hear what you're saying. I got the same criticism in my own substance dualism show from Anthony 66. All right, cool.
yeah.
Yeah, so basically what we're doing here in today's show, we're following up from last time. Um, Last time we kind of went over David Kemball-Cook's argument from the problem of evil for atheism. And he asked us during that show, he asked me kind of thing. I provided my Molinistic Defeater that everyone's familiar with, and that was serving as an undercutting defeater that undercuts David Kemball's Cook's David's justification for believing in one or more of the premises. And during that, David kind of said, like, okay, but other than, can you actually try and provide an argument in premise format, or at least semi-premise format, and prove that this Molinistic defeater is actually true, so that it's a rebutting defeater? And I've never attempted to do that. And as I think we're going to find out today, I still don't think I've been able to do it. Um, but I gave it an honest shot to take on that burden of proof and let's see what happens type deal. So, yeah, I guess to start off, David, would you be able, I've set it up so you can share your screen. Do you want to just like, if you have the original argument for problem of evil,
Oh, mine.
Yeah,
Yes. Okay.
just to
Yeah.
remind the audience, kind of thing.
Sure. I will share that, and then we want to look at yours, don't we?
Yeah.
So you'll put that on, but certainly. Okay, I can do it. And there.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. So you see what we're saying. The way that we set out the arguments is it's clear what are premises and what are conclusions there, and we I was expecting the theist or the Christian theist to object to premise 4.
Yeah.
If God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil, because I was thinking that a Christian theist would likely say that God has other desires as well, like promote soul making, or promote free will, which conflicts or alternative desires, so that there are other things that God has on his plate. And so evil is he does not want to eliminate all evil, because that would interfere with those other objectives or desires. So I was expecting you to object to premise 4, but you went in and objected to premise 2, which I was not expecting at all. So we went round that quite a lot, didn't we?
We
But
did.
I hope it was clear what I thought. The structure was that the weak point of the argument from the Christian theist point of view is premise 4, and but we actually talked a lot about omnipotence, which I thought was a diversion, because I thought omnipotence really means omnipotence and a power to do anything that's logically possible. And so, but you had some more qualified idea of omnipotence, which I thought was a bit of a diversion.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I remember when you came back, I did kind of clarify that. I kind of modified your premises. So, yep, premise 2 is not a problem, and I focused solely on premise 4, saying that God does not have the ultimate desire to prevent or refrain from actualizing all evil. And that's, I think, where we were gonna debating the last time we argued it, and that's where my Molinistic defeater came up, because I was saying, well, actually, there's a greater good, right? That God has the ultimate desire of saving as many free will souls as possible, and the only way to do that is to actualize this world that has unfortunately some evil in it. And that's where you kind of put it to me, is like, well, do you have an argument for that notion, or are you just giving it as a undercutting defeater? So I've attempted to come up with some kind of an argument and premises for that. So if you take down yours, I'll put up mine. And
okay, just before I do, I think we just I think we should comment on this, that this argument is logically valid as far as I can see. The question is whether it is sound, is down to, I think, premise 4. And I think that's what you're hitting on now as well.
Yeah.
Is that your defeater is aimed at premise 4. I understanding it's a valid argument. The conclusions follow from the premises. And I don't think you're objecting to premise, really, now objecting to premises 1, 2, 3, 5, or 7. I think you're now accepting all of those. So if I'm right, that your defeater argument is aimed at premise 4, is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. I just had my minor modifications to the wording, but yes,
that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know where we are.
Yeah, cool.
Good. Right. So
All
stop
right.
sharing.
So it's my turn.
Yeah.
Okay, so I spent about 45 minutes just coming up with this. And I kind of, just bear with me. For me, it's trying to come up with this from scratch and come up with the main elements. David, in terms of validity, if you spot a hole, cool, you can let me know. Maybe there's a missing premise, whatever. But
yeah,
the main thing is its sound. I think that's where the bulk.
Well, of course, of course, of course. I mean, first of all, is it valid? And secondly, is it sound? I should say, Dale, that really, William Lane Craig should have done this years ago, shouldn't he?
I think I guess so. Yeah. Like I've
Yeah,
never.
he should have done. I mean, you pointed me to one of his videos, which was from about 10, 11 years ago. Um, but he's a Molinist and he's arguing, obviously, um, as a trying to get a defeater for the problem of evil. So he should have set out an argument like this long ago.
The
He's uh,
I I'm not sure about that because well, let me put it this, you know the difference. There's an undercutting defeater, which is where we just try to undercut the other's justification. You're the one making the claim. I'm just saying, how do you know that? You don't have proof
yeah,
that. And then there's the rebutting defeater. So I've attempted to make this rebutting defeater kind of thing. We'll see if it
okay,
wins or fails. Um, but the reason why I was hesitant to do it, and possibly William Lane Craig doesn't want to do this either, is we have to make that fundamental point that look, whether I succeed in doing this with this argument today or not, I can just provide the Molinistic defeater as an undercutting defeater, and it's you. The problem of evil will fail unless you can disprove, the essence of the Molinistic defeater is right or wrong, because the burden of proof isn't adopted. Now, what we're doing today is I'm saying the heck with it. I am going to make a positive claim. I'm going to say your problem of evil argument is wrong, and I can prove it's wrong because this Molinistic defeater. And so I'm adopting a burden of proof on my end as well.
is that the same as is that same as an argument undercutting my premise four?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
All right.
Okay, well, yeah, I know. And in the talk that you gave me the reference to, he talks about that. He talks about God might have reasons like free will or soul making for allowing evil.
Yeah,
He talks about that, but he does not set out the argument in a logical way.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that can help kind of thing, right? As long as
Mm,
that fundamental point about the burden, because you get it personally when I've asked you, but other atheists don't. They just
mm,
always shift the burden on to the skeptic. They make their, well, evil exists, therefore God doesn't exist. They
yeah.
never meet their burden, and instead they shift it
No.
to the Christian to prove, if they come up, oh, a soul making defense or something like that. Oh, well, unless the Christian proves it, then I'm right, kind of thing. And that's
Mm,
not the way it
mm.
works. So, all right.
Brother, I'm not an atheist, Dale.
I know. I'm just saying in
You
general.
said other atheists.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah. All right, cool. So
I
so let
still
me
believe in God. I still believe in a God. I'm a theist.
gotcha. Yep.
Yeah.
And I had you in mind here. So all right, so let me go over this. The first premise.
Okay.
So God, and I just because I know David Kemball-Cook believes in a different type of God. So as understood under the Molinistic defeater. So he's the Christian God kind of thing, defined that way.
Mhm.
And he is minimally omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect. If God is omniscient, then he minimally has knowledge of all true propositions.
So that's another premise, isn't it? Is that what's a kind of definition of omniscience?
Yep.
Yeah.
And okay, so here's my first sub argument. Therefore,
Mhm.
here's the sub conclusion. So at this point, I was following argument patterns. This is a modus, what,
Mhm. Modus ponens.
modus ponens, affirming the.
I think, yeah. Is it no? Oh, I think so. Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, therefore, God minimally has knowledge of all true propositions, right? So that's the first sub argument. I can't see how you would. Do you have anything to say about that, or do you want me to just go on? Or
Well, we can point out here that one of the, if you like, the defeaters for the problem of evil comes from an open theism perspective, which denies that God has knowledge of the future.
Mhm.
And we may say that if we've got an idea of the future as consisting in as some single future, that is what is going to happen, but God doesn't know. Just like we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, God doesn't know either. But so it may be true that I will eat cheese for lunch tomorrow. I think it's very likely to be true that I will eat cheese for lunch tomorrow. But if I actually will eat cheese tomorrow, then if God is omniscient, he knows that. But under the open theist perspective, God does not know that.
Gotcha. Okay.
So are you familiar with this line of arguments?
I am. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you saying now, are you just raising that as another way of doing that, or are you saying that open theism is somehow a false, like somehow attacks this sub argument here?
Yes. Molinism, open theism is attacking premise one in the sense of understood by premise two, that there may be a single future, but God does not know it.
Okay.
So it is a way out. It's not one that I'm very keen on at all. But I know, obviously, open theists, Christian philosophers who are open theists, and who may use that as a way of getting around the problem of evil.
Gotcha.
But anyway, so with that, shall we move on to
Yep.
some
Well, just
four? Yeah.
sure. Just
Yeah.
one little point to that. So just so the audience understands, so I would say that the open theism or any other concept of God that's different than this would not count as a defeater against the truth of this premise. Why? Because what is this? This is my argument to prove specifically the God of the Molinistic Defeater. So that's the only concept of God that's relevant to this argument. Obviously, you can have like a meta critique that, well, I don't believe in that God, so or something like that maybe, but I'm kind of like trying to restrict it there, so that's why I don't know, does that make sense? Or yeah.
Yes, indeed, and we are at liberty to accept or reject that premise one.
Gotcha. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Okay, so then premise four, okay, great. So just still moving on with God's omniscience. So, okay, there are in fact true propositions corresponding to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Um, just to explain what that means, what any given free creature would freely choose to either to will to do or to will to refrain from doing in any given actualized set of circumstances or state of affairs. And I specified that this is with respect to one's meeting or failing to meet the biblical requirements for salvation, because that's the relevant aspect. So it's a very specific set of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that we're looking at for the Molinistic Defeater argument. Oops, this is okay. Okay, cool. So then from 3 and 4, again, it's a valid modus ponens pattern. So therefore, God knows all true propositions corresponding to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom related to one's meeting or not meeting the biblical requirements of salvation.
May I come in there, Dale?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and I wonder if they really exist.
Okay.
If this happened, I would do that kind of thing. Craig uses the example in his discussion with Justin, not Justin,
James White.
No, the other guy from Canada.
Paul Helm.
Paul Helm. Thank you. I knew it was Helm. I forgot his first name. Yeah. If the army had gone around the right flank, they would have prevailed. That's right. Now Craig is absolutely right in saying that talking about these counterfactuals is the bread and butter of everyday discourse in a modern society. If I hadn't done that, then this would have happened. If only I hadn't, or if only I hadn't refrained from doing that yesterday, my life would be different. All this, if I hadn't chosen which universe, that other university to go to instead of this one, my course, this would have happened. And all of that, this is the way we do reason like this.
Mhm.
But just the fact that we reason like this doesn't mean that these propositions have actually truth values. I mean, we may think that, I mean, we talk about it, we give them truth values because we think up in our minds what's likely and what's not likely. But is there actually anything that in the reality that makes these things true? Is there, you know, a kind of alternative universe, an alternative world in which I chose A instead of B, and that happened, if you like. So
Okay.
the consequences were there. Do you see
Okay.
what I'm saying?
It's the
I'm
grounding.
questioning
The,
I'm
the
questioning the
ground.
existence of these CCFs as actual propositions whose truth values can be obtained, whose truth values are definite with 100% probability. I know we argue about them and we use probabilistic reasoning to talk about them. We do this all the time, don't we, Dale? All you know, in life,
Yeah.
if I'd done
Yeah.
this, if I'd done that, this would have happened, that would have happened. If I did ate that sandwich, I'd have had a stomach ache. But you know, using our reasoning. But I'm saying, is there actually something that makes this true? You know,
Okay.
or is it just our own reasoning on probability grounds, which enables us to make decisions or just talk interestingly? Do you see
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
I know William
It's
Lane Craig thinks that they are, but I've read in various papers dispute about this that they may not exist at all. You know, that there's philosophical disagreement about the existence of these things
yeah. And okay,
in
so
terms of propositions that have truth values.
okay. Okay. So here's my response. So you're talking about this what came up with William Lane Craig debate with James White on Unbelievable, and it's the grounding, known as the grounding objection,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes, yes.
Okay, and just to clarify for the audience, because I think this will be helpful, you're not just denying that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, you're denying that there are any counterfactuals at all. So like it's a wider set of propositions that you're saying, what's the grounding for those? You're not just
Yes,
okay, good.
yes.
Um, so here's what I would say if somebody responded to that, right? So I actually have a difference of opinion with Dr. William Lane Craig and Marvin Wallace, who's a listener of the show and he's a fan of Unbelievable. You know, David, you know him. Um, so I think it's called a truth maker maximalist, right? So I do believe that there are truth makers. Most philosophers would say that, you know, things like counterfactuals or in order to be true under a correspondence theory of truth, you have a truth bearer. So this is like a sentence or a proposition, and if it corresponds to reality or a truth maker, something in reality, that's what makes it true. And most philosophers say, well, in order for the correspondence theory of truth to be true, you don't have to have a truth maker. I'm a weirdo in that I am a maximalist. I think there does have to be a truth maker. So, what on God's green earth would be the truth maker for counterfactuals, let alone counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? And it's basically under my definition of God. I think that under God's aseity, which the Christian God would espouse, all potentialities, the counterfactuals exist as potentials within God. God has the causal
Hmm.
capabilities to actualize one set of circumstances versus another. So, and those circumstances we would respond accordingly based on our free will or something like that. So that's what I would ground them in. It's in God. It's grounded in God's causal potential, in his partly in his mind, because he knows the
Hmm.
propositions to create them. But yeah, I would ground them in God.
Is that the same as saying that God knows all the possible worlds?
It's more than just saying he knows them. It's saying he has the power to actualize them as well. They exist as potentials within God, God's causal potential to create
Hmm.
that world versus that another one.
Hmm.
Makes sense.
Yes.
So
So, so is this what's called middle knowledge? For in the case of the counterfactuals of human freedom?
Yeah, this would correspond to God's having the middle knowledge, right? These
Mhm,
counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, the
mhm,
specific subset of counterfactuals,
mhm.
that's corresponding to God's middle knowledge.
Okay, so so it comes down to his omniscience then, does it? That's
Yep,
premise one.
yep, exactly. This is
So
it
so
just kind of spelling out exactly what how omniscience entails. God does have middle knowledge.
so you could actually then include this in if you restructured the arguments to say that omniscience minimally are so on as number two, but then maximally has knowledge of all counterfactuals.
For premise two, you're saying, like, just say,
You could augment premise two by saying he minimally has true knowledge of all true propositions, and maximally has true of all proposition, has knowledge of all counterfactuals. Or maybe you're
yeah,
just,
yeah,
I
for
mean,
sure.
no, I mean, maybe you're just including counterfactuals under propositions.
Exactly. Like I could just be
Yes.
like true propositions, including counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, because
Okay.
that's the key set of
Okay. I see. I
propositions.
understand. I understand. Right. Um, so my problem with that then is questioning whether counterfactuals can be true. Like, for instance, if I eat cheese uh, tomorrow, I will not have a stomach ache. But yeah, if I eat ham, I will have a stomach ache. And so, uh, and I actually ate cheese. I didn't get a stomach ache. But the proposition was if I eat cheese, if I eat ham, I will get a stomach ache. Or if I had eaten ham, I would have got a stomach ache. So that's an example of a CCF, isn't it? And you're saying that God has to know that. That's part of God's knowledge. What would have happened if I had done something which I other than what I did?
Yes, and or like another reversing it the other way around, sort of saying like if if I win $1 million, I will buy a car. I would buy a
Mm,
car. If I don't win the lottery, I would not buy a car or something, or I would refrain from willing to buy a car, or whatever you want to say. Um, I think that in the first place, it's true in a properly basic way, right? It comes down to what philosophers call this dual ability. And I think that that's true in a properly basic way. There's also some scientific evidence for it. It's not conclusive. I had a debate with Val and he gave the proper response to it, but it's still supporting evidence that supports how things either seem to us if you're a phenomenal conservatism proponent, or in my way, it buttresses this properly basic belief, right? So
mhm,
it comes down to I think we can clearly see that there is a truth value to this proposition. If I had $1 million, I would go out and buy a car. But if given the new circumstances, I don't win the lottery, I don't have that spare money, I would not
mhm.
buy a car. That's obviously true or false kind of thing about me. So
So
it's
is that what makes it true? The fact that there is some possible world in which Lucky Dale does win the lottery, and he does go out and buy a car.
yeah,
Is that what makes it true?
yeah. God could have actualized. God had the power to actualize that world
Yeah,
in which
yeah.
those circumstances obtained.
So yes, so somewhere out there is is
Yep,
Dale, a very rich Dale with a car.
there we go. That lucky bugger. I'm jealous, but
Yeah, but but not this world.
not this world, unfortunately. No.
Yeah, yeah,
So that
yeah. Okay. So I mean, so I wanted then to note there's a debate about this.
mhm.
And so I know your point of view. I'm skeptical now. I'm skeptical that these, I know obviously they exist as propositions, but uh, but I dispute that they have truth values that can be ascertained or determined. Obviously, we may attach probabilities. I mean, we may say it's absolutely certain that Dale is going to buy a car if he wins that lottery, but that's our opinion. We won't know it's true unless you actually do win the lottery.
Let me well, I think God has created us with modal evaluating faculties, which does give us reasonable access to other worlds, even if they don't exist. But what I want to ask you is let's start with the creaturely free. Forget about the counterfactuals or the grounding for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Do you at least agree that we do have creaturely freedom, that we do have a dual ability to will to do something or to refrain from willing to do something, or do you deny it?
Um, yes, I do.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so great. So we do have this dual ability that's evidently true. So then in terms of the counterfactuals, um, obviously there would be propositions that could apply to each of those abilities being actualized or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And those could be true or false. And then it's just the question of, well, is it true that what is it that grounds these things? And I would just say, well, apart from deny, like you would, it comes back to again denying premise one, because God, as I've defined him in premise one, the Christian God is described as existing a se, or he has divine aseity. So everything, every potential, every proposition, everything that exists in creation is comes from God, is ultimately explained and or caused by God in one way or another. Um, so it would make sense if you accept premise one. Could I get you to admit at least that much? If you accept that God at premise one?
So you're asking if I accept premise one?
No, I'm saying if you were to accept my definite understanding of God,
Yeah.
uh, that then you could accept premise four about the counterfactuals under my understanding.
Yes, yeah, okay. If yes, indeed. Under your definition of God, who has access to all these possible worlds. Okay, yes.
All right, cool. So that's great then. So we're kind of seeing that ultimately, at least so far, the only really objectionable thing is premise one. I got to get you on board with my definition of God, the Molinistic Defeater notion of God. Then,
Yes, yes.
all right,
That's
that's
right.
cool. I didn't expect that. So that all right, that's cool. That's cool. Um, so yeah, I guess moving on then. So that kind of takes care of the God's knowledge part, getting the middle knowledge of my argument. So then I need to talk about God's power, because obviously that comes into play as to what world God or set of circumstances God actualizes. So I'm
Mhm.
saying, look, God only has the power in premise six. It's a premise. He only has the power to actualize metaphysically possible states of affairs or circumstances. And it directly follows from that as a conclusion, just the opposite is entailed. Therefore, God lacks the power to actualize any metaphysically impossible states of affairs.
Mhm.
So I know you were asking about what does it mean to be metaphysically possible. Do you have anything you want to discuss with these two?
Yes, well, you pointed me to Craig's talk there, his lecture,
Mhm.
and he made a distinction between what's possible and what's feasible.
Yeah,
Now, but he didn't actually use that phrase metaphysically possible. So, if possible, if possible, can you define it? What does that mean, metaphysically possible?
sure. And elsewhere, uh, metaphysically possible, I think, comes from Alvin Plantinga, who William Craig bases feasibility off of. So Alvin
Mhm.
Plantinga, there's a difference between strict logical possibility and broad logical possibility. So strict logical possibility, that's what every layman understands, right? It's an explicit violation of the logical law of non-contradiction. So I say that David Kemball-Cook is wearing glasses at this time and in this place, and David is not wearing glasses at this time. It's an explicit contradiction. So that's what we would call strictly logically impossible. Then we get into the notion of broad logical possibility, or what I call metaphysical possibility, or what William Lane Craig called in that talk feasible versus infeasible world. So these are again contradictions, but they're implicit. So you have to understand it's not an explicit A, not A, but A, not A is entailed once you understand properly. So, and a famous example from William Lane Craig is Abraham Lincoln is a prime number, or something like that. Well, there's no A, not A explicit, but once you understand, okay, Abe Lincoln is essentially a human being, a substance, a concrete substance in the form of a human being. A prime number essentially is an abstract or mental object. So the two cannot be. It's like saying something and he's not something. So once you understand that, yep, it violates the logical law of non-contradiction. That's my meaning. Other philosophers, there is different understandings of it, but that's my understanding. That's what I'm using it in this premise here. So in terms of this free will debate, how this relates to these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, I would say, given our free will, that we are free will agents and stuff like that, there's a set of all strictly logically possible worlds. And let's say there's 10 for the sake of argument. So there's a logically possible world where I'll use the example of God, right? So God is sinless and he's essentially sinless or whatever. But I think controversially, there's a strictly logically possible world where God lies, where God sins. God can do evil. That is logically possible. But it's not feasible. It's not metaphysically possible given God's nature. So there's only a subset of those worlds that are actually metaphysically possible. Where's the hidden contradiction? Well, it comes from God's nature. He is essentially morally perfect. Therefore, he couldn't exercise his free will to actualize the world where he lies or sins. Does that make sense? Or
yes, so metaphysically possible means possible in practice. It's possible because there are no implied contradictions.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So,
and I gave the example. The reason I gave that example is our free will, is part and parcel of this, right? And that's what.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a vegetarian, Dale. So actually, the scenario that I eat ham for lunch tomorrow, is that metaphysically impossible?
I would say not, because you're not essentially a vegetarian. It's part of your character traits, but obviously you have the ability to do that, the power to eat that. That's a contingent fact, and it's a contingent part of your nature. Maybe a very, very close, like a very ingrained property or attribute, but it's not.
So tomorrow you could win the lottery and offer me £1 million to eat a ham sandwich.
For sure,
instead of spending it on a car.
Exactly.
And then I take the money and eat the ham sandwich.
Yep.
I go against my principles.
Exactly. It happens all the time. People go against their principles. So
yes. Okay. All right.
Okay. So moving on. So
okay, move on.
Yeah. Okay. So here's premise 8. This is going to be a controversial one. In my own notes, this is the premise where I think the argument fails when I have the burden of proof, because I don't think I can prove this. So, but it's essential, right? So I say it's metaphysically impossible for God to actualize a state of affairs where either no and or a different amount of quote unquote evil actualizes, and whereby the same number or a higher number of free creatures, past, present, and future combined, freely choose to fulfill the biblical requirements for salvation relative to the actual world in which we live, whereby a certain amount of evil in the precise way, form, when, and everything, all the details have to be precisely the same. There is no other world where the same number or more people freely choose to be saved, and yet there's no evil states of affairs that actualize. That's what this premise is.
Mhm.
And yeah, I don't know how I would prove this. And this is kind of the Achilles heel of the atheist, because I don't think the not the atheist of the problem of evil proponent. I don't
Mhm.
think you can prove that this premise is probably false, but by the same token, I have no idea how to prove that it's probably true either. And that's why I typically don't try to prove the Molinistic defeater. I just raise it as an undercutting defeater.
Right. Well, it seems to be an absolutely necessary premise for the argument,
Yes.
and as you say, it is the crucial premise here. If we can accept your definitions for the moment, then number 8, we can argue about that. We're talking here about counting numbers of free creatures.
Yeah.
But I think I might have said to you on the last discussion that we had that this kind of reasoning that we're putting in the mind of God has got no basis for in the Bible. I think I said that is that this is kind of reason, the idea that God is counting numbers of people saved as a goal is nowhere got because got no scriptural warrant at all. And it seems to be plucked out of thin air. I mean, how do we know? How do we know that God is counting numbers of saved people? And I mean, it seems like one of these games. I think there's a science fiction story there where God and the devil are actually doing this. You know, they're playing, they're counting, and the number that gets the most wins.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's a good story. I mean, but it's you know, I mean, the punchline is the end where the Christian said, "What you mean? It's just a game?" Yes.
Yeah, the best the
Uh,
best they can do. So that's where premise 9 comes in. I'm saying, yeah, God does have this ultimate desire. So we can
yeah.
prove from the scripture that he does have the desire to free to as many free creatures as possible will meet the biblical requirements for salvation.
Well, in detail, but that's not again what the Bible says, is it? I was talking today with somebody about what the Bible says about salvation, and I said to you previously that I think now it's really unclear what the New Testament says about salvation, whether or not the conditions for it and God's desire. I'm just looking at First Timothy 2, which is an important verse here. Verse 4, talking about God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth. Now, that's a pretty clear statement about the mind of God on salvation. And he doesn't say who will have as many as men as possible to be saved, which is what your premise is talking about. It says all men, all humans, in other words. And so, it's a good verse for universalism there. And my complaint, my problem is that actually the New Testament is inconsistent about what it says about salvation, and there's strong evidence for universalism in the New Testament. And this is one of those verses.
So here's how I would attempt to establish it. And bear in mind, I like I said, I don't think I can meet my burden of proof with premise 8. But if I'm going to attempt to cobble it together, so I would appeal to these Bible verses that establish God has this important desire that as many free creatures, as many that everyone, if possible, everyone. He wants everyone to be saved, right? So in the first place, my Molinistic defeater, I realized I don't need to argue. If you think universalism is true, cool. God needs to create this world with evil in order to save everyone. It doesn't matter how many people get saved. That's inconsequential to the truth of the Molinistic defeater. So cool. So we know biblically God wants everyone to be saved. We know biblically that it's the most important factor for human beings. We have verses that say, look, the heck with everything, lose everything in this world, it's trivial relative to obtaining salvation or having that relationship. So on an individual level, that's the most important thing for us. And we also have from premise one that God is morally perfect. So perhaps from those elements, we could cobble together an argument that, well, therefore, God would want to save as many free creatures as possible because he would do whatever the morally perfect thing to do is. It's morally the morally perfect thing to do. He has this desire for people to be saved. And we know that that's the most important thing relative to every other pleasure or benefit on earth in terms of earthly concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, yeah, we could kind of argue from that that God would want the ultimate number of people to be saved. And obviously, we know that he has created this world. So you got to kind of it's kind of begging the question in this argument a bit, but you could cobble together that to say, well, yeah, well, therefore, this world must be the world where that maximum amount of people, whether it's everyone or
Mm-hmm.
everyone minus one, I don't know what the numbers are, but I do know that this world achieves that morally perfect result. Do you think
Okay.
something there? Or?
So right. So this comes to the important issue then of what is the metaphysical possibility of somebody's salvation? Now, a universalist would say that it's metaphysically possible for everyone to be saved, and that's what will happen because that's God's desire. Now, you might disagree. I think most Christians might disagree with that. But it comes down to then our view of how God acts and how we view free will. So if we've got a Calvinist reformed point of view, then we believe, if you have or anyone has, a Calvinist would say that God has laid down from the beginning, from the dawn of time, who is going to be saved and who is not going to be saved. And it is those who are going to be saved. It is only metaphysically possible for those whom God has decided in advance that they will be saved. And it's metaphysically impossible for anyone who is destined for damnation to be saved. So you see what we've got in these premises here. We've got assumed some implicit understanding of how God acts in relation to human history and salvation. On the other hand, if we might have we might believe in free will. What's it called? When you've got the absolute free will to do yes or no, go off script.
Libertarian.
Sorry?
Libertarian free will?
Libertarian, thank you. Libertarian, yeah. Libertarian. If you believe in libertarian free will, then what do you say then? Well, it's metaphysically possible for everyone to freely choose. Even the most dastardly evil creature could repent on their deathbeds. Adolf Hitler and Pol Pot could repent on their deathbeds and choose God and be saved. So there you have metaphysical possibility for everyone to be saved. So it's on you really, I think, to make it clear what your view of God is.
Well, okay, so I agree and I disagree. So the first thing to say is, look, what you're talking, remember I said what you're talking about now, this argument for universalism, that, okay, cool, let's pretend that's true. That doesn't matter, right? What the issue with this premise is, though, is God's actualizing this world complete with the evil in it. Is that uh, needed in order to allow for universalism to take place? So I just want to clarify that it's not a debate about, well, does the Bible say some people are going to be going to hell or some people saved? Regardless of how you answer that,
Mm-hmm.
and I have no secular grounds. I just follow divine revelation, and whatever I think it says, that's, God has that knowledge. So I would just believe him. But whatever way you answer, let's pretend I've misunderstood the Bible. Let's pretend
Mm-hmm.
universalism is true. This premise still stands. It's just a question of, well, is evil needed in order to result in that universalism? And
Okay, indeed. So well, this is the point then. And why do we need evil at all? You put it there as a premise, but that kind of covers up the issues here, which we were talking about last time, about soul making and free will and these other reasons why we might need evil.
Yeah.
But
So
you don't mention them here, but you kind of hide it in the premise, saying, "Oh, we need evil." But why do you need evil? Why?
yeah. So that would need to be spelled out then. Like, how do I?
Yes, it would. It would. It's hidden away here, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's not. It wasn't like I'm trying to hide something, but I'm just saying, like, in this premise says it's metaphysically impossible, right? So when I'm providing warrant for this premise, um, I would need to get into those details. Well, what is
You
it?
would.
How do I know
Yes.
metaphysically impossible? And so I can answer why it's metaphysically impossible, but in terms of providing warrant, well, how do you know that this is the case? So why is it metaphysically impossible? Let me just answer that quickly. It's because
Hmm.
our will is taken into the feasibility option. It's impossible given this set of circumstances and my will responding to it. That's what makes it metaphysically impossible or in non-feasible for me to choose to do the opposite, or to
Hmm.
not do that action. So it's not, we're not governed by anything external to ourselves. Those simply play influences. And I've done a lot of work on the will and how it works, and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I've even did a paper on acrasia and stuff. I have a unique Christian notion on that. But okay, so great. So that's my story. This is the story of why it's metaphysically impossible. But
Well, indeed, you would need you need a whole argument for this, I think. But I think it can be refuted quite simply. Again, I made this argument in my presentation, is that if we just think of, say, this present world, and we subtract from it one instance where, say, an animal dies in pain in the forest without this, and we subtract, say, an animal um, goes into a trap and dies in pain. If we subtract that instance where the animal actually that instead avoids that trap, the amount of evil is diminished, but the number of creatures saved is still the same.
yeah,
Or say there's
but that
a landslide which kills some people, or even just kills some animals. Uh, if we subtract that landslide or avalanche from the world, the amount of evil diminishes again, because there's a subtraction of the natural evil. But again, the numbers of people saved remains the same.
okay, so no, you can't. You can just assert that, right? You have the same problem that I do in reverse. So you say you can refute this, meaning you can prove that
Yeah,
premise.
well, it's a thought experiment.
Okay, cool. But here's the problem, right? So number one, you whatever change in the states of affairs or circumstances, God creates the world where, I don't know, like he saves one deer or something, right? One less deer from dying at that moment or something. Okay, cool. So he actualizes that world, but those changes in the events aren't in isolation. They have connections and have impacts on other things. If you take over eternity, not over eternity, but over the course of all human history, past, present, and future, what does the change of a single event? I mean, you have things like the butterfly effect, right? So that's just at the same moment in time, a butterfly flaps its wings and then it just has immediate consequences and stuff like that, right? So we live in a very interconnected system that will have impacts, unforeseen uh, impacts, just by changing one minor little event can have drastic consequences. And that's even impossible for a human mind to predict. Oh, well, what causal chains will result from this single chain, let alone how will the causal chains change in terms of human free will agents. That's where I think it's even more impossible to predict. We can predict deterministic changes to some extent. And then not only that, but how will it impact the causal chains deterministically and with free will agents over all of human history as well? in order to arrive at that final number of people who choose to be saved versus not. I just think that's impossible for us to do. And I admit that on my end. That's why I can't independently prove this premise that it is true. It's metaphysically impossible for the same number. But by the same token, I don't think you, as the problem of evil person, can prove that it is metaphysically possible either.
Well, I would agree with you there. We can't 100% disapprove. Maybe that deer that escapes is going to become a rogue deer and possibly develop the ability to talk and talk somebody out of their salvation, or possibly, or does something which makes somebody very angry and when just about when their point of giving their life to God or something like that. So yeah, you construct that, but we're talking. I think about plausibility here. Is we can prove nothing. You know, we're talking about what actually seems to us to be arguments that seem reasonable, and it does seem that we got this. If we got this little deer in a big forest, miles, thousands of miles away, hundreds of miles away from human civilization, where in general all the deer live their lives without any contact with human beings, it does not seem plausible that that little deer escaping the trap is going to affect the number of people saved or reduce the number of people saved. It doesn't seem plausible to me. I know it's theoretically possible, but you take my point, do you? Is that you're positing this very, very powerful premise here, and I'm pointing out that there are immediate objections, which
Yeah,
are, if not 100%, knocked down, are certainly plausible objections.
they're plausible, but I just think that it's not being honest, right? So okay, so let me respond this way. So in the first place, look, you could say I'm being a hypocrite because I do depend on our modal evaluating faculties in certain circumstances to know that there's counterfactuals and we can make reasonable predictions in certain cases, especially when it's just a purely deterministic causal chain or something, right? So we do have some ability to do this, but where I think it's just a total free for all is when it comes to predicting how a free will agent, we just have our modal evaluating faculties just break down at that point in a way it doesn't do so for God. We cannot predict. I mean, I dare you to try it. You think you can predict predict a certain event and then that's going to happen, and then the next 5 steps in the causal chain, including at least 2 or more free will decisions, and try to predict how those free will agents will respond to those sets of circumstances. I think 9 times out of 10, we're going to fail. And that's just a simple little experiment. Imagine predicting how those causal chains will influence multiple free will agents over all of human history. I mean, what will happen 100 years from now if you let that deer live? It goes out into the woods, it gets rabies, and I don't know, an animal kills it, eats it, it gets rabies, and then it attacks a human being.
Yeah,
Human being
I
happens
agree.
Adolf
Yes,
Hitler.
I know. I take your point. I take your point. You know, anything is possible, but this premise 8 with the premise 9. So this is really the game, isn't it, Dale?
Mhm.
Is that what you need to have for this defeater is supporting arguments based on the free will, which is what you were majoring on, I think, or I think you were, weren't you? The free will defense to support this premise 8.
Well, yes, if I'm advancing it as an argument, but when I'm advancing it as an undercutting defeater, nope, it's on you. You've got to prove that this isn't true. Like that scenario I just gave, it's not just possible. It's
No, Dale, no, Dale. I just don't have to accept it. I don't have to prove it's false.
yes, if I'm in the context of today's show, yes, absolutely. But in the context of our last show where you had the burden of proof, I can just say that this is equally probable. That scenario I just made up about the deer, that's equally probable, right? To happen. You can't say it's not just possible, it's equally probable unless and until you can prove that it's improbable, or in the context
Yes.
of today's show, it's equally probable unless and until I can prove that it's probable, probably impossible.
Well, right. I don't think we can really talk about probabilities of statements being true in this context. Uh, we could just say that they're not certain, that they're disputed, or we can't be sure that they're true. We can't prove them beyond doubt, but we can't talk about equality of probability here.
Well,
Can you see a cat
well,
behind me?
let me say
Yeah.
this then. So I think we can, right? Because in philosophy, there's a thing called the principle of indifference, right? So the default starting point is in Bayesian talk, it's 50%, right? Either the hypothesis is true or the hypothesis is false.
Yeah.
That's the default, unless and until someone provides reason or evidence to favor one thing over the other. So in context of today's show, because I'm making the claim you're not, it would be on me to kind of say, no, it probably is metaphysically impossible, and I would have to provide some reason as to why that is. I can't do it. I'm admitting defeat. Um, but in the context of our last show, where you're making the claim about the problem of evil, uh,
Hmm.
proponent of that, they have to say that it probably is metaphysically possible,
Hmm.
51% or whatever, and you have to provide a reason. If you can't provide a reason to prove to show that, then we stay at the default principle of indifference. It's either true or it's not. I'm 50-50. I don't know. I have no reason to
Well,
face it.
we can say, I mean, just because we're indifferent doesn't mean we can talk about probabilities of being 50%. It just means we don't have enough information there to make a judgment. Um, but the equivalent point in my argument for evil was my premise four, which is if God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil.
Mhm.
And that is, again, it's a statement which would need supporting arguments. So is that right? Is that the same equivalence there as my premise four and your premise eight? We're making premises which are contentious and would need supporting arguments.
Uh, yes. So yes, in the context of you making your premise four, you would need to provide uh, a supplemental argumentation or something like
Yes,
that to back that up. One of which
yes,
would be having to refute this Molinistic defeater in an undercutting form.
yeah,
Um, in context of today's show, yes, I would need to somehow back up this premise if
yeah.
I'm making the positive claim that, hey, this is actually true. This Christian Molinistic defeater it's actually true that it's metaphysically impossible
Hmm.
for God to create a world without evil, and yet the same number of free will people
Yeah.
choose to be saved.
Okay. Well, I think this is the important point then, Dale, is that someone is going to read that and say, why? Why is it true? Give me a reason why I should accept this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And
Yeah.
the best I can do is, so with the principle of indifference, it would be 50% true. Now, what that means, just to qualify, because I know you object to that, I'm talking
I
in
object to it. Yes.
I'm talking in a Bayesian sense. So 50% for the prior probability does not influence the probability one way or another. So it's the same as me saying, look, there's a
Hmm.
0% probability, evidential proof that it is metaphysically impossible, and there's been 0% evidential proof supporting that it is metaphysically possible.
Hmm.
We're in that middle. We don't know.
Hmm.
So that's what 50% represents. So don't get thrown.
Yeah. Yes. I object to that way of thinking. I don't think it's meaningful to talk about 50% probability of something being true if we're indifferent about it. And I think there's a lot of some people make assumptions about probability which are not actually warranted. I think that there are quite a few different kinds of probability in operation here, and we're way out the furthest reaches of human reasoning when we're talking about probabilities of things like this being true. I don't think it's meaningful to talk about something like the probability of God existing for instance.
Okay.
And and so that's why I object to the probabilistic arguments from evil from that point of view. And to me, either God exists or he doesn't. You know, it's either a 0 or a 1. It's either 0% or 100%. Now, we might think about our opinions of God existing as being on a scale between 0 and 100%.
Yeah.
But that's not, of course, that's what's going on in our minds. That's just our opinion. Yeah. It's not actually a state's affairs in the real world. You know, there's
Well,
no possible world in which God exists 50% of the time.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Ontologically speaking, you're right.
So I object to this reasoning using principle of indifference.
Well, the principle of this isn't purely epistemic, right? I'm talking about degrees of warrant or epistemic justification when I'm talking about and again, nothing. I don't need to use the percentages. I can just say, look, we're indifferent. We don't know whether it is metaphysic, probably, or
okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about. I agree. Well, if you want to talk about our epistemic probability, all right, this is our subjective probability, our belief, if you like.
Yeah.
Which could be on a scale between 0 and 100. That's fine.
Yep.
But then everyone's scale is different.
For sure.
And everyone's prior is different. Well, you might find 2 atheists who agree on a 0 for God.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. You know, Richard Dawkins and give me another atheist, Daniel Dennett, will agree on their priors for God existing as being 0. But basically we all have our different scales, don't we?
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And even within ourselves, we have intra-permissivism as well, which means when I do my probabilities, they change over time and stuff like that. So
yeah, I know exactly. Yes, indeed. So we've got multiple variations here, and we're talking about subjective reasoning. But sometimes I think these arguments, they're dressed up as objective.
No.
So it's like
okay. Sorry, I'm going to shut up. I'll let you finish, but
no, okay. Well, I think I've made my point is that there's confused thought about probability, where we present subjective epistemic argumentation and dress it up as something objective.
Okay, so I've put in terms of me, maybe this is generally true. That's not what I'm doing. I put a lot of thought into how I use my subjective probability judgments, which amount to the degree of warrant that I have for whatever it is.
Okay.
But so even though these are subjective probability values, that doesn't mean that they don't have an objective basis. The reasons I provide for that subjective assessment are in fact objective. And what I think that the way God operates, on an epistemic level, I am a permissivist, which means I can allow for variation in the subjective probability values. I think God's role, though, is to the extent that sin is not affecting our cognitive judgments, we can be within the reasonableness range. So maybe I'm 95% convinced the Holocaust happened and you're 96%, just for the sake of argument. We're both within the reasonableness range. We can permit those variations. But if some guy comes up to us and says, well, no, there's only 20% probability that the Holocaust happened, there's something wrong with that guy. He's not within the reasonableness range. He's either.
Or to take a more recent example, that the Earth is flat.
Yep.
The Earth is round, and you and I would agree maybe on 99.9% there.
Absolutely.
But then along comes the flat earther, who's at 0.1%.
Yeah, David Weiss. He was on my show debating.
Oh yes.
Teddy. Yeah. The flat earth. I put you in touch with one of those.
Yes, that's right. So I had a very interesting debate, discussion with the guy you put me in touch with. So thank you for that. Yes. No, so that's really interesting. But the thing is then is what constitutes when does the subjective become objective? Is it when enough people agree? Like, most people would agree that the Earth is round. And so when does that's our 99.9% all join together to give us an objective fact?
I think that so the probability, the assessment itself would always be subjective, but it has an objective basis. So the evidence that I'm giving is objective. Here's my reasoning, and you can access that reasoning and evaluate it yourself. The only time the probability itself would be objective, which is very limiting, and nobody, not a single person, not even yourself, would subscribe to this only using this kind of probabilities, I think.
Yeah.
In a frequentist sense, statistical. Oh, there's a 1 out of 52 chance of pulling this card randomly from a deck, or there's a 1 out of 6 chance. Those are the only times the probabilities are actually objective. You can, if the probabilities themselves are based on objective facts of the world.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I made some notes here. I think I counted about 6 or 7 different kinds of probability. Where I can run through them if you like, but maybe that's not too relevant. But the probability that a fair die gives you a 6, being 1/6, is objectively, but of course the die has to be fair.
Yeah.
So it's in an idealized situation.
Yeah.
That's, you could call that mathematical probability. It's the kind of probability that I deal with as I teach mathematics. You're probably familiar with that as well. But that's a different kettle of fish from the probability that that there is a God, or probability that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, or the probability that Caesar actually lived and evaded assassination and went on to live and die, natural life, the probability that Jesus rose from the dead, which are alleged, all of those are alleged historical events. Probability of God being existing is some kind of is a metaphysical notion there of what my opinion about God, basically. Different kinds of probability. Another type of probability is probability that my team will win the league this year, which is something about the future, which has a value, but it's not known. Or rather, once a year has gone by, we'll know whether that statement was true or not. But this expressing opinion about future events. So these are different kinds of probability, Dale. And so we make a mistake if we lump them all together. I think it's all just one thing, just one concept.
Yep. No, I fully agree with that. All right, cool. Well, let me ask this then, just to finish off on premise 8. Forgetting about the probability question, because that's a huge complex issue and stuff like that. Let me just ask you this way. Would you agree that you are indifferent to whether it is metaphysically impossible or metaphysically possible for blah, 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 for, whatever it says in premise 8 here? Are you indifferent for that?
Me. Yeah, I'm indifferent. I'm indifferent because I'm the concept of salvation, to me, the biblical standard of salvation, has become for me a problematic concept for reasons that I was trying to go through last time, but maybe we need another time that we could actually do justice to that. I think we agreed that we would do that. And so it's the whole context of it that I'm skeptical about. And I don't think, I also made the point that I don't think that God, if he exists, whatever God thinks, he doesn't think like we think. I don't think he's counting numbers of people saved, in that ridiculous science fiction story that I mentioned. God is actually playing a game with the devil, and they are counting numbers. But I don't agree that the author of the universe has got that kind of mentality, just if you see what I mean. So I'm not just indifferent, really. I'm rather negative about the premise because I don't think it's the right way to think about God.
Okay. So again, it's kind of going back. We would need to debate. You think premise 1 is false, that God is not a Molinistic Defeater type God, and yeah, we would need to debate that. But in terms of the problem of evil, which assumes a God under the lines of Molinistic Defeater, I think I have a huge success here in defeating the problem of evil, where you have the burden of proof, because you're saying, look, no, given this premise, we need to be indifferent to the truth or falsity of this premise. And that's enough to defeat in an undercutting way the problem of evil. So that's a failure there. Likewise, I will admit, in terms of today's show, where I have the burden of proof, I've totally indifference. If because you're indifferent, I've failed to meet my burden of proof. I haven't proved that it is probably metaphysically impossible, like or something like that, leaning in that direction. So
Yeah.
like that's the way to think about it.
Yeah.
We don't know either way.
I
Uh,
agree. I agree. Yes.
cool. Yeah, so I'd probably work on something. I think I gave those elements. We know God's moral. If I were to try to budge you from the indifferent into thinking it is metaphysically impossible, I would use God's moral perfection and Bible verses about him
Yeah.
to
You'd
say,
have to get me on board with premise one, of course.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's going to be the Achilles heel, it seems.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
I would need to prove that that definition of God is in fact true for this argument to
Yeah.
work.
Or you'd have to get me to accept it, persuade me. Um, yeah. And that would be the first step. Then if I accept premise one, I may well go along with premise eight.
Awesome, awesome. Well, yeah, I think that covers it. Is there anything
Yeah.
else we missed? Are you
No, I think this has been really helpful, Dale. And as I said, I'm surprised that William Lane Craig hasn't put out something like this. And I think there's a if no one has, then I think there's a gap in the market.
Hmm.
Yeah, for you to get a paper on this
Hmm.
and and get this out. But as I said, you'll have to get more for premise eight and unpack the definitions and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that's good. Oh, one thing I wanted to say before we stop is that the talk you gave me back, William Lane Craig in 2011, he
Mhm.
talks about possible worlds. But it's really interesting because I'm sure he was a Molinist then. He must have been,
Mhm.
but he says that God doesn't actually know what free agents are going to do in any possible world. But the whole point of middle knowledge is that he does know in the world that he actualizes. He does know. That's why his choice of which world to actualize is based upon his middle knowledge. Now, he didn't use the phrase middle knowledge once in that lecture
True.
or in the discussion afterwards, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. I
So
don't.
you listen back to it and then tell me what you think later on.
Yeah, yeah. If he did, so he screwed up badly. Because I
Mm,
know for a fact he doesn't believe that. So if he said that,
yeah,
that's a mix up.
yeah. Well,
The,
see what you think.
the only
Yeah.
thing was he wasn't describing the like free knowledge, natural knowledge, and middle knowledge.
No, he didn't discuss that at all.
Okay, because that the only thing
Yeah,
I can think of is God doesn't know, and God doesn't have free knowledge, I think, until he creates.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, if he's just saying in advance he doesn't have middle knowledge, that was a
Mm,
mix up. Cool. I'll listen back to that. So yeah,
yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I think this was really, really helpful. It helped me understand um, where the differences are coming from, and it's even surprising that number one is really where we would need to focus and stuff like that. But yeah, I guess I'll have you back on in a month or two. What do you want to discuss next in terms of your
Well, I think we were salvation is the big question for me,
okay.
and we've touched on it tonight. We touched on it on the last discussion. So from my point of view, that would be the next thing on the agenda, and I'd like to run through the different ideas of salvation, how they match up with what's in the Bible, to support my contention that the New Testament is not clear on what you have to do to be saved.
Awesome.
And so that would be what I would like to talk about.
Okay.
But we can also have another go at this if you've had another uh, and chance to do some more work on it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. And in terms of salvation, so it's specifically the conditions for salvation that you want to debate, and you're not claiming that they're contradictory. You're claiming that they're unclear or confusing.
Well, yeah, I think they're contradictory. It's. I mean, I have two problems. One is that it is not clear. I mean, you could take. I have several scenarios, but you take the hypothetical example of a totally evil person who repents on his deathbed. Is he saved? Well, you can look up New Testament passages that tell you he's damned because of his works. But on the other hand, that you could say, no, he's saved because of his faith, even though he has no works. On the other hand, you could have a very good person and a pillar of the church who commits some evil act on the last day of his life before he repents. Does he go to heaven or hell? Again, the evidence from the New Testament is unclear what happens to them. And I asked this in my church last year, I think, and on a question and answer session. And one of the pastors, a minister, replying, gave one answer. I think the evil person who repents on his deathbed, he said that person goes to hell. And then I took that up with him afterwards by email, and he gave the opposite answer then. And then I asked another minister, what about these scenarios? And he said to me, we'd need a whole day and night to sort this out. So I said, right, you've just proved my point, is that the New Testament is not clear what the conditions are for salvation. Is it by faith? Is it by works? Is it by grace alone? Is it faith through works, work through faith, grace through faith? Is it just God's decision? All of that, it's just not clear. The other problem with, and you have, clear works passages and faith passages in both the Gospels and in Paul. The other problem I have with salvation is that the New Testament says nothing about the salvation status of people who die at childbirth, people who lived before Christ was born, people who've never heard of Jesus Christ, people who are mentally defective, so even if they did hear, would not be able to understand. All of that. The New Testament says practically nothing, except unless you look at the end in Revelation 21, where you say that people were judged on the basis of what was written in the books. Just looks like works. So those are my two major problems.
Awesome, cool. Well, yeah, we will. I'll be in touch sometime September, October, and hopefully we can get David Russell. And he had to work today, so
okay,
it'll be the three of us again. So yeah,
it would be, yes, it would be really good. I'd appreciate that, and hopefully it'd be interesting to listeners. And today's been a really interesting discussion, so thank you for that.
Oh, no problem. No, it was great. Thank you for it. I think it was really great in helping me to understand your perspective, and sounds like vice versa as well. So awesome. All right. Well, I will let you guys go. Next week, I have a Theo Geeks podcast with David Russell, where it's his topic. We're doing an analysis on the Beatitudes specifically. So look forward to that, and have a great week.
Right. Thank you.